J'avais eu le plaisir de dire au cours de ce grand colloque de la Sorbonne que nous le placions, qu'il était placé sous l'égide de
This symposium was organized
urgence. Nous avons essayé de comprendre quelles étaient
on the backdrop of solidarity and with
pour tous les professionnels de santé
our
qu'ils pouvaient trouver
friend
avec vous.
here,
Courte partie de nos entretiens.
Xavier Ducrest, the chair of Alliance Urgence Organization. You'll be sending out a call for health professionals. Thank you very much for giving me the floor for Alliance Urgence Action Against Hunger, Médecins du Monde, CARE, and
et la ministre, Madame Vidal.
Humanity inclusion. Basically, our role is to build bridges between sectors to innovate. We keep improving and strengthening our impact in the field. We need innovating. We need innovation. We need to innovate in our connections, in our relationship. We need you. We need your research centers. We need your ecosystems. You need our data. We are engaged in continual experimenting, testing and learning. We need to build up these gateways, these bridges to improve and strengthen the impacts of our activities in the field. It was great pleasure to listen in to the difficulties, experiences of our students. So thank you all students. Thank you for your mobility, for your innovation. So sandwich here, 6 months of placement, irrespective of what you need. Alliance and Urgence organizations here to help you provide care to people with vulnerabilities, with disabilities, with disease. We need you all, you as a health and medical professionals, and you as health and medical students. Thank you. We were very happy to have you. And now I would like to give the floor to Christian Vaguette and Masha Voronov for the third panel session.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, more gentlemen than ladies. I'm Chris van Geet, Vice Rector of KU Leuven, University of Leuven in Belgium, and you all know Leuven maybe from the university, but certainly from the city where Alaphilippe won the World Championship road running last Sunday. So this session is about the position of universities in the pandemic COVID-19. And as we all know that this pandemic has been a challenge or is still a challenge for society, but certainly also for universities. And everyone is also convinced when you look at it at an external view that science and scientific evidence has been gained at a speed that was never seen before during, well, the first weeks of 2020. The new virus was identified, and before the end of that same year, there were several vaccines, effective vaccines approved by FDA and EMA. So this is really a victory for science. And universities are within society, are part of this society. So it's also clear that universities played an important role in tackling this pandemic. First of all, I think by the fact that all these different disciplines, all experts that were needed at the beginning and still yet at the hopefully at the end of the pandemic, that all the experts came from academics, came from universities. And it's not only the experts of biomedical sciences, virologists, immunologists, epidemiologists, infectiologists, but also from all the other disciplines, legal expertise, computational expertise for the track and tracing, sociologists, anthropologists. Almost every discipline was involved in the comprehensive universities to give or to handle over experts to the politicians that had to take the decisions. There is a very bright side to this. I think that population, that society has seen that what science is and how science develops. And I think the connection with science was better than ever. The successes of science were seen, and also universities that are not ivory towers, but they played their role during last 1 year and a half in society. In every European country, experts were on national media almost every day to explain to the population what happened. Also, students were involved. In our university, students, mostly from the Faculty of Medicine, they were working during the first lockdown in the care centers for the elderly. They organized for themselves and for their colleagues test and tracing centers that were much more effective than the test and tracing centers from the government, for instance, and that were also much more effective with a lower incidence than the general population in the same age group. So that involvement of universities in the pandemics was really very pronounced. But there was also a dark side, or a dark side still is there, and that is that when science develops, then we used to handle in an evidence-based way, but when there is a new virus, evidence needs to be built up, and it's not there from the beginning, and experts were communicating with nuances, and some of the media were enlarging the nuances and polarizing the different communications against each other. And then there is a social media. When you have a not evidence-based opinion and you put it on social media, then colleagues can, or not colleagues, people in the population, they can join that opinion, and then it becomes a bigger opinion and a bigger idea, and that comes in contrast to the evidence-based science. And this can come to a very extreme point that experts are threatened, that they need police protection, and so on and so further. This is the dark side of what happened, in my opinion, the last months regarding to the role of the position of the universities and of the experts in COVID-19 pandemic. But let's move to the next speaker, and I give the word to my colleague.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. So this session will be querying the way academia, with a capital A, has defended the need to defend science in our societies. It is critical that we address the role and place of universities and academia in defending rationality and science under the various angles of those who produce science, those who communicate science, and those who spread and disseminate science. Under the exceptional pandemic circumstances that we discussed today, as well as on issues of substance, where when sciences advance, they generate societal changes. And in such times, academia should be looked up to, but too often its contributions, the contributions of academia are sidelined or not recognized, and sometimes undervalued. So it is our pleasure to greet Jean-Francois Delfresso, who is a doctor, who is a faculty professor in immunology at the Paris-Saclay Medical University. He is the chair of the COVID-19 Scientific Committee, which was set up to guide the political leaders of France to manage the health crisis. He chairs the advisory committee of France. He was the head of the National Health Committee on AIDS, and he headed up the INSERM Infectious Diseases Unit. Dear friend, dear Jean-Francois, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup pour
Thank you very much
cette introduction. En fait,
for these very kind words by way of introductory remarks. I'm first and foremost a doctor,
qui a vieilli,
a physician and a colleague who got older and who got on my shoulders a heap of responsibilities. And with the help of the scientific committee, we tried and engaged in collective intelligence with some degree of humbleness, and we tried and succeed in this task. I will review a few topics and a few issues. First, we are in an epidemiological situation, which I would call is calmer and got appeased thanks to vaccination. I would say that Europe has been a good student in the vaccination response. Europe has been a good student, I would say. With this appeased, calmer response, I would say that in the next few weeks, in the next few months, until we are still confronted with the Delta variant, we should be okay. Now, we don't know what will come after the Delta variant. Will there be a muted gene? Will there be a new gene? Will there be a new virus? Or will there be a more endemic situation? We saw how the fourth Delta variant wave was more or less neutralized by the rate of vaccination. What's happened in France, more so than in many European countries, there is a proportion of people aged more than 60 years old who haven't been vaccinated, knowing that this is the frailest and most fragile part of the population. Now, the question which arises for our entire community is whether we can start speaking of the end of the crisis, or that we are entering some kind of a transitional phase, or whether it is too early to say so. Well, we are in the process of investigating this question. There are, of course, huge political challenges, knowing that in our countries, the policy leaders, the policymakers, and politicians are the ones who make decisions. And the situation is similar across all large European countries, whether they be a so-called health pass or green pass. This raises the question of when, building on some scientific evidence and data, we can somewhat find some degree of freedom, i.e. individual and Republican and democratic freedom, whereas we, and I among the first, have promoted a number of collective restrictions. Now, I don't have the answer to this question, but this question needs to be asked, and it's a good thing that we ask it. The second key point is whether science was here to deliver. The answer is yes, of course. I might be disputed as to why I'm asking the question. The science has delivered, but with some kind of a lag. Remember the very difficult period of March and April of 2020, where we didn't have much in stock. Science has been fragile, has been weak. So for a scientific committee or a body of experts which should provide advice and recommendation based on evidence-based medicine, how do you move forward when science is under development and very frail and fragile, even on very basic data as to where people get contaminated in the Journal of Infectious Disease and Science? These surveys date back from December of 2020 with convergence evidence and result. December of 2020 only, even though common sense identified some well-identified places of contamination, but science was very plentiful. You might not believe me, but I looked at scientific production in the case of HIV and AIDS between 2003 and 2016, when the three-drug therapy came about. 1996 it was, between 1983 and 1996, sorry, with the scientific literature literature which was produced over these 13 years to be compared with the scientific production which covered the 18-month last year. 5 times more scientific production and production of papers compared with the 13 years of HIV/AIDS. Now, the question which arises is that open science made headway and progress, but for my generation, there's something which is very disturbing, is that open science has resulted in 95% of non-referenced publications. Until when is open science interesting? It is interesting, but up to when can we base our opinions on articles which are not peer-reviewed? This might be a generational topic, but I'm finding it a bit disturbing now. As we've seen, scientific production was produced based on a miracle being vaccinations, where reasonably we expected vaccines, but we didn't expect that they would be so effective, and we wouldn't believe that they would come about so quickly. With one interesting point, which shows that science has developed and changed, where we know that these vaccines are protective and that protection against the severe forms of COVID is very strong, but does not protect so much against infection and contamination. So vaccines have done something which is unusual, and this raises more questions today. With respect to the variants, science has been moving and changing, especially at the European level, which are the 30 sequencing platforms. The UK led the way, but the other countries and France have improved. In France as well, we can sequence, we can treat 20,000 sequences per day, and this was a tremendous headway in progress. Now, with this moving and changing science as a discussion, one very difficult issue for a scientific committee, knowing that science being frail, how can you come up with advice and recommendations when you have qualms and misgivings and doubts as to what you see? The second factor is to have politicians and policymakers understand that science is built up and based on doubting, and time. So policymakers and politicians have to take quick decisions. So the notion of time and time is not the same. So making them understand that we will be asking questions, but that it will take time for hard science to respond. It's not so easy for them, these politicians, to understand now. And the third point is how the European Union responded to the crisis, and to which level did it respond. I would say that it delivered a level of response which was better and more effective than what might accept or what might recognize. Now, of course, initially in the spring of 2020, it muddled through, basically. It groped its way forward. But very quickly after that, there were a series of headways and progresses, most of which being the vaccines, of course. 700 million European people vaccinated, 700 million vaccines sent to the global south by the European Union. This is not enough said. This is the region of the world which was the most successful with respect to its vaccination campaign. So it was a major victory. But remember the initial discussions in December of 2020 and the beginning of this year and the course of 2021, considering it was not quick enough, but it worked very well. And there were other examples as well. There are lessons, though, to be drawn on the lag, the initial lag, and delays taken, especially in the first few months. Remember that health, and this was said and repeated several times today, health as a policy is not part of the European agenda. It is part of the national agendas. How can we make it a priority? When you look at European surveys, European respondents state that health has become a priority. So 60% of Europeans said so, 16% more than last year. So today, the issue of public health has been made a priority, which was not the case. I remembered when the new European Commission was put together, the Health and Safety Commission was to be a subcommittee to innovation. It was not to be a commission by itself. And innovation sometimes has nothing to do with health and safety. So Europe responded well, I would say, with ethical choices which we as Europeans made, and societal choices which were taken in a very common and joint and shared manner, with some nuances with respect to the 2 or 3 Scandinavian countries for diverse historical questions, because they have a different set of ethics and ethical choices. Making a choice of living with the virus rather than trying for zero COVID was a choice which was shared by most European nations. What was shared as well was the fact that we wanted to protect health while limiting and restricting individual freedoms and responsibility, interfering with a key democratic freedom in order to protect health. Was it the right choice? I believe it was. It was shared by many, not by all, this choice. And the current discussions is exactly focusing on this. How can we restore larger individual freedoms? But the idea of protecting the frailest, vaccinating the frailest and the most vulnerable first, those who were most prone to developing severe forms of the COVID virus, was shared by most European nations. Now, there were nuances and differences in views. The views of children under COVID was very different. France decided to keep the children at schools. There were some ups and downs, but we all agreed on this. France left its schools open. Some countries took a different view and position. Vaccinating teenagers, where 75% of teenagers above 12 years of age were vaccinated in France. Other countries did not take this view and this position. Now, if I still have 5 or 6 minutes ahead of me, I would like to review some more points. The first is that as we are on the verge of exiting this crisis, health is a priority for the largest number of Europeans, both young and old. We spoke about the issues of mental health, the fact that the training education of some medical students were sacrificed, that they had to work on the field, in the field, and that they sacrificed some of their training. You read about recent data that we are experiencing excessive over-mortality in the last 2 years due to COVID. Those who wondered whether this pandemic was significant, we have over-mortality statistics which prove this very clearly. But what we are missing, and this is a question which universities and research and statistics institutions have to query, that is, what will be the impact of other disorders or on other pathologies, on lack of treatment, of late treatment, and we are lacking data on this. My last 2 points will be not to oppose issues of innovation and issues of public health. We need both. We need to work and progress on the 2 fronts. They shouldn't be contradicted. They shouldn't be opposed. Innovation. Now, Europe played its role. We can but observe that, as in other spheres, the US has been very active and present in this area, and we need to understand and recognize that many startups and people originate in European men and women who left Europe and went to the US and other places and really started new products and services, and were the origins of the new vaccines. And the question we may ask ourselves is why it wasn't possible in Europe. Now, Europe wants to equip itself with a new European agency, ERA, which aims at accelerating its agendas. I hope it won't just be a new administrative machinery and that it will be truly effective and operational. With respect to the stakes and challenges of a number of natures. Europe was very present with sequencing. Unfortunately, it won't be so present on new drugs with direct fast action on the virus, which will be introduced in December, new COVID anti-retrovirals, which will be introduced by Anglo-American labs. Now, with respect to public health, Paul Ricoeur said something very nice. Diseases are private aspects, but public health is a public aspect, and public health is not the addition of individual data. It has to be constructed. It is said that the COVID crisis is about some kind of an insufficient response by the public health powers and authorities in France. I'm not sure that it is specific to France. Of course, it challenges our views and vision on public health. The UK system and the Anglo-American systems and models were very much disturbed by this crisis. The CDC in the US floundered and made a flop for quite a while. A number of its tasks, roles and powers were taken up by other US agencies. So this interfered with and disturbed some public health authorities. The true, real discussion and debate which has to be tabled, which is driven by Franck Chauvin, as to which new construction for public health, quote unquote, it's a question of recognizing two preliminary principles. Number one, health shouldn't be only viewed as a cost. Health should be viewed as a value system which is critical, and we are able to share some common shared European values. Now, I have three modest, humble proposals. I'm not an expert in public health, even though I had to work a lot with public health practitioners and experts so that we can move the debate forward. The first, which can be challenging for deans, is that for universities, I'm more and more convinced that public health faculties and institutions should be multidisciplinary faculties sitting within larger universities where doctors would be trained as well as non-doctors, non-medical staff, organizers, coordinators, people who would be activists in NGOs. This could be relevant. This could be desirable. And we need to ask ourselves in France as to how we should build up the public health system going forward. We probably should set up a more operational, a more hands-on, in the field public health system, more so than has been done in France. And it is critical that large centers of research for public health be consolidated, be centralized, that we have some key large research centers which would team up with some large schools and universities so that headway and progress can be made. Three final points, cross-cutting points on this crisis, which is still in the process. It's always difficult to draw lessons when you are in the middle of a crisis. But I would like to share 3 points. The first is around scientific culture and scientific communication, which are 2 different aspects. I agree with you. Scientific culture, with what was said, dear colleagues, in your introductory remarks, is critical and fundamental, which needs to be owned and embraced by universities. My question is, after this crisis, where physicians and scientists and researchers have been very much challenged by societies with a very challenging model, and a model which is being challenged, rightly so. How to advance the model, how to advance the notion with the citizens. This has to be taken up right from the early years in schooling, as well as by political leaders. There are 500 people, basically, who lead France, who organize and govern France, all very brilliant, 95 of them coming out of one type of school, where they are no longer trained in scientific and science matters. No longer. It was my habit to be in contact with policymakers and politicians. When I worked on AIDS, we looked at issues as to how science can help and guide policymakers and politicians. Well, I realized at the time that, of course, they move very quickly. They have quick brains, but that we needed to query the fact that our elite politicians have moved away from scientific culture and are ignoring scientific culture. And universities should tackle this issue really. My second point is, and we saw this in that crisis, is the ethical challenges, with a key ethical challenge, whether science should be given priority over individual freedoms, which was the response we decided during this crisis. And I wonder whether, and again, it depends on the universities, and I guess a number of you have gotten involved in that, but in the education and training we give to our young medical doctors, the time spent on values. Why do you engage in medicine? What are your ethical values? That this field of values and ethics is not invested enough. So I suggest you do more time spent on values versus technical skill sets. And my last point and third point will be on basically trust, because managing crisis is about managing trust and confidence in the policymakers, in the politicians, in the physicians. And it's a question of building up democracy in the health and medical sphere in the form of a triangle between the politicians, the experts and practitioners, and the citizens. These are three ends of the triangle, with the citizens deciding what type of health they want for themselves and they want for a community of people. These are the fundamentals of health-related democracy. And this was very much challenged. We need to rethink this. France was leading the pack at the time. We need to rethink this and review this by involving the younger part of our community, the younger part of our population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Delfresso. With you, the last questions you asked, you kick-started our panel discussion perfectly. With Patrick Levy, we decided we would divide it into three sessions. The first session that will add to everything that's already been said about the expectations of private citizens. What do they expect? What can we provide them with? And what has the COVID crisis contributed in terms of new media, and how the private citizens receive all that information. And with Gilles Gressani, the head of Le Grand Continent, a new e-journal. Then second session with those who are the gatekeepers of scientific knowledge. We have a number of deans and chancellors amongst us. And the last part with journalists, with Pascal Morel, who's specialized in medicine, with Daniel Messager, and with the representative of the Lancet, editor-in-chief of the Lancet, Richard Horton. We will touch upon open science that Jean-Francois Delfresso touched upon. So let's kickstart the panel discussion. Patrick? Well, thank you very much. What Sylvie Benzaken has just said was actually perfectly introduced by Jean-Francois Delfresso, because the proposals he made and the comments he made at the end of his presentation were the perfect transition or segue. So, which begs the question of truth, rationality. How can society and university tackle that question? Well, it is an absolutely central question, and I am honored to be amongst you today. Well, it is at the heart of what we've decided to do with this e-journal, Le Grand Continent, and our development. And I want to pick up on that triangle that Jean-Francois Delfresso mentioned. So with three angles, knowledge, the building of scientific knowledge, and not only hard science, but also social sciences. Second angle, the power, and the power of the state, international power. And lastly, the sort of mediator, the media, the public space that is supposed to be the space that brings the other two tips of the triangle together. So my impression is that when there are major crises, such as the COVID crisis, we realize to what extent one of the tip of this triangle cannot do it alone. It's everything in between these three poles that actually can find a way out of the crisis. And this is pretty much what we've done with Le Grand Continent, our e-journal. We've realized quite early, and of course our agility helped us. We realized that with the COVID crisis we were faced with something that required exchanges between these three poles. And very quickly, very soon, it dawned on us that we had to collect testimony. We had to listen to the voice of a doctor from Bergamo in Italy when the crisis had not reached France yet, so listen to that personal account, that testimony. And immediately we're part of an international network of scientists. And then there was the narrative that you build, which is absolutely essential to tackle that question. And then there's the analysis, the synthesis, and constant publication. And it was a time when research was in the making. And but even so, we had to be able to step back and have some distance and critical thinking, so that we could inform journalists, decision makers, and private citizens. And the last thing, which has to do with data, COVID crisis has immediately caused a sort of national reflex, and people tended to think that what was happening in Italy was not the equivalent of what was happening in France. And we looked at both the European scale, but also at what was happening on a regional scale. So measures such as transfers of patients from one part of France to another. So these questions of data and visibility are very important, I think, because we went from being an e-journal that had about 500 views per month to having 1.5 million views. And I can only explain that because there was a demand that was not met. And the question that I ask myself and that I would like to share with you to fuel the debate. So there's a need to use the rationality of scientific knowledge and widen the notion of rationality. We talk about rationality, and we often thus have a vision that could be restrictive. And I'm being possibly a bit provocative, but in conspiracy theories, in the most basic conspiracy theories, we realize that there are two components: an attempt to administer the proof and evidence. Every conspiracy theorist tries to build a reasoning by giving evidence. But what's completely missing is stepping back scientific method, scientific reasoning. But at the same time, it can be there's the capacity of science of being the paradigm that organizes our vision of the world. And another thing that I thought was really interesting, especially during the first wave of the COVID crisis, was to realize to what extent immediately private citizens tried to use references that were completely heterogeneous, the question of peer review, preprints. We heard about the Lancet like they were a football team. And I think we have to interpret this in a good way. It's not because we tackle these questions by trying to convert people to rational thinking that we have to disregard the need that people who are overwhelmed need someone to give them answers. And, you know, the Greeks mastered the art of demonstration. And to defend science in universities, we have to advocate for a broader rationality that will address the question of both political decision-making, but also debate, discussion. And the rationality that science puts forward is not only about what's true or false, but it's also the rationality of method and building a narrative and a demonstration. Thank you very much. I don't know if Flukiger is with us. Can you hear us? Yes, Yves, can you hear us? Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Well, I think that's perfect timing because you are the Chancellor of the University of Geneva, and you have been in that position for a long time, and you found yourself as head of that university having to face a number of difficulties. How did that university of yours tackle that question of science being a bit in jeopardy, or at least called in question? How, as the Chancellor of the University of Geneva, do you fight for rationality? Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for that opportunity. I think science, over the last few months, has produced a number of results and achievements that were have been quite spectacular to demonstrate the importance of fundamental research, the importance of applied research, but it was also a risk, which was that of the confrontation of experts on the one hand and opinions that we sometimes find in society and that are often put on the par. I want to remind you that 2020 has been a phenomenal year for science, with a plethora of publications, with leading researchers that have redirected their research to address this crisis. And the time to develop a vaccine has been an unprecedented success. What is it due to? Well, to unprecedented collaborations, university collaborations, publications, the possibility of having access to research and data that was at the basis of the analysis, and financing that was also unprecedented. But first and foremost, the importance of fundamental research. Messenger RNA vaccines are based on fundamental research that started 20 years ago. So science is an iterative process that gradually reveals the truth. It starts with confrontation, whereas society and politicians look for answers as quickly as possible. And researchers, and it's important to remind everybody of this, are also always bear in mind the precautionary principle. and sometimes some people think they're too alarmists, but science is also a challenge because we are faced with an overabundance of information. We all know the principle of these algorithms that mean that the opinion that I can form is also built within a group that thinks the same as me, and there no longer is a dialogue or a discussion. For me, there are 5 rules in matter of communication that we should always remind everybody. Firstly, we need to inform rather than trying to persuade. There are sometimes people who want to convince so much, whereas we should really put the emphasis on information. Transparency is the second rule that is extremely important. We should always look at we should always be transparent in terms of the uncertainties, what we don't know, and the risks and benefits. And establishing the basis of what we put forward, not over-communicate. Faced with a lot of misinformation, what can we do? Well, I think we need to strengthen the trust of the general public in science. This is something that we need to build in the long term. And second point that I want to highlight, I think scientists need to stay in their field of expertise and learn how to better communicate, which is not the case of all of our colleagues, and collaboration. It's been reiterated, collaboration between universities, the scientific community, and the media. So what can we do concretely, practically, to improve that dialogue? I think we need to build multi-institutional platforms between schools, universities, also multidisciplinary platforms. Maybe we've been under the illusion that technology would be enough to get us out of the crisis. Well, there are resistances. There is reluctance and resistance against vaccines and resistance against applications also to detect and contact and trace people. There is resistance and distrust. Also distrust because there's a lot of data sharing, and it has to do with the coordination between the different stakeholders. And I think also we need to make it possible for every single member of the public to understand how science is developed. So there is a need for more participation by private citizens. Train politicians as well. I think that's a duty on the part of higher education and academia. We need to meet with politicians more and more so as to make them understand how science works, and also develop tools of fact-checking. It is the task that a cell or a unit within the WHO has set up to fight infodemics that can be as dreadful and detrimental as the pandemic. And it is a field in which our university in particular has committed to work. Thank you very much. We're going to give the floor to another stakeholder in academia who also has that kind of responsibility, is the Vice Dean in charge of international affairs at the medical faculty in Leuven.
No problem.
So I will make it was a short intervention. So I'm in the institution of Professor Van Heet, so she is the big boss. I'm the small boss in medicine. But she already alluded to a very important aspect. Our university has really been in shock. And why? Not because of the pandemic, because we solved the pandemic. We could save people. We have witnessed it from the first bench. We have very good virologists at the Riga Institute in Leuven who worked at all these antiviral drugs and were involved in the vaccine strategies in Pfizer in Belgium. So there was a scientific attitude of solidarity, and in the hospital, I had to do supervision on the ward together with my interns, or the residents as we call, or your interns. So there was a sense of solidarity. But then something happened. A virologist who was very active in the media, a very good expert, had to really, together with his family, was put into a safe house because there was a lonely wolf, as they call it, so a military man who right-wing, and was really pushed by social media to hunt for this virologist. And so we had a professor of our university in a safe house who continued to give lectures from his safe house to the students. He was not afraid, but of course, university was in shock. And so our academics are not only under attack in social media, some are even, they need police protection, and even more than that, it is a terror for the family. And others now, and the same virologist is now dragged before court because he criticized anti-vaxxers. So what is happening? This guy is not bending at all, and he does not want to be defended by the university because he said, my presence in the social media is my responsibility, I speak out and I don't need support for anyone. I will defend myself, but still, it is not the capacity of many others. So I fear for self-censoring. And so many people will stop speaking out because of these threats that are going on. So we need some input and help to preserve our academic freedom. And this is not something that the university can provide. But I will come to this academic freedom later on. A second point is the issue of doctors who defend charlatanism or who spread non-scientific complot theories in their patient population. So, therefore, we have l'Ordre des Médecins en Belgique, so it's the Belgian medical authority, and they made a statement in January, and I will read it: doctors are deontologically obliged to take the lead in advising and promoting vaccination against COVID. But immediately, this statement has been challenged by anti-vax doctors, and an appeal was lodged with the Council of State, but last week we were notified that the applicants were unsuccessfully, and we now have a body, sorry for the mask, now we have a body of really a deontological body in Belgium that can really act against doctors who spread fake news. And this is only a small part of our communication, but at least we can talk about training doctors. And as deans and as vice deans, we know that the professional attitude of a young doctor, we can try to form it, but we can only, and our rector always said, we just color by. We don't really form these people. They have a history at home of friends or whatever. We can only shape a little bit, but we cannot transform someone. So if it goes wrong, we need a deontological body that really is governing this fate. So for all those people who do not like l'Ordre des Médecins as an alternative to the courts, I say I believe in deontology. So just my conclusion, I make a plea for really academic freedom. It should be maintained. But of course, academic freedom comes with responsibility and respect for divergent opinions. When I heard the rector saying from Geneva, we need not to persuade people, we need to inform them, but we need very much to respect divergent opinions. So if you provoke someone on social media, it can bounce back to you. And so our rector, in his introductory speech at the beginning of the academic year on Monday, stressed this point, that we should, in universities, always respectful for other thinking people. And this is not really evident. So this is really a difficult task, and we should train our students and our fellow academicians. And on the other hand, the protections of citizens and patients from doctors who defend or support charlatanism and fake news. So what we really need, and I fully support the intervention of the rector from Geneva, we need the concerted actions of politicians, deontological bodies and universities, and I think we need more doctor politicians. So we need really to train doctors and to offer a special track in political science. But otherwise, we have seen an oncologist this morning who was member of parliament also in France. So this is the only way to go. And what I see in Belgium for the last decade, we see less doctor politicians. It's perhaps coincidence, I don't know how it is, and that's a question also to the panel. What's the situation really in France with doctors that are involved in politics? I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Peut-être une remarque.
Well, maybe a comment on the fact that was mentioned earlier was the importance of scientific culture for amongst politicians. It's a problem everywhere. We saw how much of a problem it was in the US, and the fact that scientific culture is missing in most in the biggest part of higher education and higher education institutions where these future politicians are trained. We're now going to turn to someone who produces science and trains students, and maybe who can explain what our responsibility is in training these people so as to meet these challenges that have been named, that have been mentioned. The former speakers. Yes, because my colleagues have highlighted the role of universities, experts, and doctors. When I say experts, it's microbiologists, but also all the experts who are present in political debate. And as we were preparing this panel discussion, I realized that universities and institutions who finance them have really realized the importance of fostering relations between science and health. I'm thinking of responsible research and innovation. We've mentioned open science and also I saw that in France there was also a research planning law for 2020-2021, and one chapter of that planning law is dedicated to strengthening links between science, research and society, with a clear will to share scientific culture, but also industrial and technical cultures. These are words, but they've been turned into calls for projects and financing. So it seems to be part and parcel of that research planning law. I also looked at a number of strategic plans of a number of universities, and many mention the importance of bringing closer the scientific world and society. Unfortunately, and I think we've highlighted all the positive aspects, but what I wanted to mention by touching upon these examples is that universities and institutions that finance them are ready to face problems such as pandemics, or were ready to a certain extent. But there's a negative aspect, which is that in spite of all the experts who were present in political debate, in the media and in specialized journals, there were a lot of local initiatives. But in spite of that, a lot of inaccurate information about treatment and COVID. And I think that should make us react as experts in the field of healthcare. And the Chancellor of the University of Geneva already mentioned a number of avenues worth exploring, and that dovetails nicely with what you said. I think in terms of education and higher education, we can probably mention a number of things that we could do. Let me give you an example. I teach first-year students, which is an introduction to drugs manufacturing, and I draw a parallel between a traditional drug development and what made it possible to develop quality vaccines in less than a year. That was information. But if everybody does that in all different courses, then we can maybe learn how to train young people better. As teachers, we also should teach them critical thinking so that they can better respond to all the fake news. I'm thinking of a colleague who actually uses a lot of advertisements for food supplements, and she asks her students to try to decide how relevant these ads are. And it's been mentioned several times we should strengthen the training of students, but also of young researchers in everything to do with communication. And we mentioned also scientific culture, because it's not always the case that this is part of their training. And if they were better trained, whether they be students or young researchers, we would probably have better communication with regards to patients, the general public, and politicians. And maybe one last point, maybe to encourage researchers that benefit from public funds but it actually happened during the pandemic, but I think it could happen in other fields, to make their voices heard in societal debates, and to highlight the impact of that research can have, but still with critical thinking. And maybe I'll wrap up by saying that on that last point, we should also take initiatives with regards to people who finance research, and maybe as part of strategic plans of our universities. And I think the relations between science and society should be recognized as an integral part of science and of scientific activity.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
On va passer maintenant à la
Let's move on
exposée dans ces tableaux
to
aux médias.
the
Donner
parts
la parole à Richard.
devoted to media. Richard Orton.
Are you connected?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Nice to see you. Well, you lead a major scientific journal as the chief editor of The Lancet, which has been at the front line during the pandemics. And of course, we are very much interested in knowing what are the lessons that you had from this pandemic, and which is not finished, by the way. And what could you say, and what can you say about the role of such a major scientific journal in that condition?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I'm not with you in person. Some of the things I will say echo remarks already made by Jean-Francois and others. I'd like to make three brief points about the defense of rationality and the role of universities during the pandemic, if I may. I'm speaking as an editor in a zone of ambiguity, sitting sometimes uncomfortably between science, medicine, policy, politics, and the media, everywhere but nowhere, in a way. But hopefully that doesn't make us too irrelevant. The first point I'd like to comment on is the notion of knowledge during the pandemic, because the foundation for evidence-based science and public health policy making saw several important transformations during the past 18 months. You've already alluded to the step change in open science very early on. All scientific journals committed to making research on COVID-19 fully open access. That was an unprecedented move, allowed unrivaled scrutiny and discussion and public use, and indeed accountability of the science that was being produced. Jean-Francois talked about the advent of preprints, and indeed preprints has completely revolutionized the way we have thought about the nature of knowledge. instead of peer-reviewed science being the primary source for discussion and decision-making, we moved into a zone of provisional knowledge. But often it wasn't clear that that knowledge was indeed provisional in the way that it was reported. A third area where we saw a transformation in knowledge was that knowledge during the pandemic was itself being, and is still being, reconstructed during the pandemic. And that proved extremely difficult for the scientific community, for the policy community, and for the public. A simple example, in the very early stages of the pandemic, we thought that the primary means of transmission was through surface contact. We did not understand that aerosol transmission was as important. Therefore, the advice on masks in the early phase of the pandemic was that they were not needed. And then the public was told they are needed. And then we had a great deal of conflict about the appropriateness or not of masks, simply because we understood better the nature of the transmission dynamics of SARS-CoV-2. And there are continuing areas of uncertainty. There is certainly in my country, there is a contest about the importance of long COVID, how common long COVID is. Is it a big problem affecting maybe a third or more of people who've had COVID-19, or is it a much smaller problem than we think? That's an area of uncertainty. Booster vaccinations. Should we be using booster vaccinations in the general population? The science says no, we should not, but there is a clamor, a demand by politicians and many in the public that they are fully protected. And so the issue of vaccine inequity gets exacerbated. And a fourth and final area for knowledge transformation, and this is a much more sinister and disturbing dimension, and that is the emergence of a substantial disinformation element as a component of the landscape of knowledge. Of course, it's already been mentioned, anti-vaccination campaigns, but let's also be very honest with each other here. Disinformation has also emerged from what would be regarded as the orthodox scientific community. And we were caught up in that, as were our colleagues at the New England Journal of Medicine, where last year we had to retract with NEJM 2 papers from a Harvard research group. Ours got more attention because it was about hydroxychloroquine, and I know it was widely reported and discussed in France. This was a Harvard-based research study in collaboration with an independent data company. And every single piece of data, as far as we were aware, was fabricated. And the scientific community failed in making sure that it protected the integrity of science. There were failures of process within the research collaboration. There were failures of due diligence within the university. There were failures in the peer review process. And in fact, what uncovered the fraud was social media scrutiny, which very quickly discovered inaccuracies in parts of the data set. So I'm actually very grateful for that social media scrutiny, because it very quickly allowed us to retract what was a fraudulent paper. Now, all of those forces that have transformed knowledge have reshaped and continue to reshape the relation between science and society. And right now, it's too early to say what the conclusion of those forces is going to be, what the consequences will be of those forces. But they do have the potential for very profound impacts on the use of science, on the authority of science in society, and indeed on public trust in science. Now, let me quickly move to the role of the scientist in society, if I may. And there are many aspects, and they all raise questions. Everybody who's spoken, I've heard this afternoon, has talked about the great victory for science. This has been a tremendous success story. Yes, it has, but we have a responsibility to ask some tough questions as well. We shouldn't just be celebrating success and basking in how wonderful science is, because there are some difficult problems. Government scientists played a crucial role as a focal point in public communication. But who were they speaking for? Were they speaking for the science, or were they speaking for the government? Sometimes it wasn't clear whether they were government spokespeople or truly independent. Scientists indeed became important media commentators, informing the public about the latest scientific developments. But sometimes, in fact, quite often, certainly in the United Kingdom, they didn't just inform, they commented, they criticized policymakers. So their role went from being a focal point for communication to being more a political columnist or commentator. And then scientists sometimes grouped together, not as independent collectives of scientists trying to inform the public, but in a truly campaigning role. The Great Barrington Declaration being one example. In the United Kingdom, a group formed called an Independent Scientific Advisory Group of Experts to challenge and oppose the government's official scientific advisory group of experts. So the science became deliberately politicized by scientists themselves through these new bodies. And a few universities, to come to one issue I know you're very concerned about, a few universities became iconic symbols of influence during the pandemic. In the United Kingdom, Imperial College London was an absolutely iconic centre for modelling. I seem to have frozen. Yeah, no, it's still okay. Oxford became an iconic centre for the AstraZeneca vaccine. Is the connection working?
It's working, yes.
It's working very well. Thank
you. Okay, good. It's freezing on my machine. So Imperial College London, Oxford. We have 4 countries in the United Kingdom. And not always do our countries happily live with one another. So the University of Edinburgh in Scotland became a centre opposing London and the London Westminster government. So these universities did play a very, very important role, but it wasn't a simple role, because the scientists and universities were also the subject of attack. At Imperial College, Neil Ferguson, who was the lead modelling scientist, became known in the media as Professor Lockdown, and was mocked and vilified and criticised as the man who was taking away the freedoms of the British people. And I already heard Brexit mentioned. We were supposed to be taking back control, and now Neil Ferguson himself was taking back control of the British people. So all of the pro-Brexit newspapers in the UK suddenly started attacking Neil Ferguson and Imperial College. So we can't escape Brexit, I'm afraid, still. The University of Liverpool, where controversial research led to the commercial success for a company called Innova and its lateral flow tests. Innova then has given £10 million to that university for a new pandemic institute. Well, is that a fantastic example of an industry-university partnership that we should celebrate? Or is it a disturbing complicity and conflict of interest between a company and a university? I only ask the questions, but I invite us to ask those questions. Last point, absolute last point. There has been a struggle during the past 18 months about the very meaning of government. Because during the pandemic, we have seen democracy edge closer towards a technocracy. Your own Bernard-Henri Lévy lamented in his book on the pandemic the rise in medical power. And it's true, the reality was that scientists and doctors did have unrivaled influence on political decision making. And again, questions need to be asked. Can political choices be so easily resolved by appealing to scientific facts? Is it correct to say that what is good for society only comes from what is true? Indeed, is the world completely knowable at all? Should scientists have a special or privileged role in formulating moral norms in society? I agree in many ways with the idea that we want more scientists and doctors in politics, but be careful there. Do we want to be having our democracy shifting towards technocracy? I do believe that we are right now at a moment of technopolitics, where our democracy is evolving into a biocracy, a politics where science, especially the biological sciences, have a growing influence. That could bring tremendous advantages to society, but I promise it will also bring new threats, because scientists, let's be very honest, are no more virtuous than the rest of humanity. They are as vain and corruptible as anybody else, and we have seen that this past 18 months. So as we step into this new moment of technopolitics, welcome it, but be careful and beware. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was great. I think you really set the stage for further discussion and comments. Et on va passer maintenant en fait à d'autres.
Let's hear other media now, and let's give the floor to Pascal Morel. This was great to hear Richard Horton, and it was great to hear our friend Chris, as in fact they reassured us by showing to us French that the worst is never a given, and that they can be even worse than what we think is worse. And we thought that in France we were experiencing the worst, and that it was better in your countries. So several observations were made, several with a high degree of quality. So I won't add to what was said, except to say that I don't want to repeat what was said. It seems to me that the team, media and science, media and medicine, is not something which is new. Of course, the COVID pandemic was exceptional, and it came about with brutal violence. But for the last 20 years, journalists have been working with media people. Journalists have been working with medical people, with health people like Daniel Messager in France, with a very large French public funded media like France Inter. But in reality, of course, we always have worked. Journalists have always worked with scientists as a team, as a couple, which sometimes was in tension and in conflict. It was, I would call it, a terrible tandem, which started with the history of medicine. It started to come about when medicine has been developing. If medicine does not develop, there's not much to say on substance. And in the general public press, in fact, the general public press has taken an interest in medicine for the last 20 years because it has become a market. It has become a means for development, a source of development, because medicine has been developing. And when medicine does develop, things go very quickly, too quickly. in reality, journalists and media people did not get trained very well in these accelerated developments. And it is important that doctors and physicians train journalists. But training journalists means that journalists have to be trained very early on. In schools of journalism, there should be contacts with the medical sphere. And even citizens need to be trained and educated in medical issues. And in medical journals, questions of science, even when they are addressed by specialist journals, they deal with these issues, and the situation and the importance of specialists of trade press has gotten weaker in the last few years. But it is of importance, as it is the one which addresses the specialist issues, the medical issues, and the trade journals, the professional journals have their own didactical issues, but usually the words and voices of scientists are never really challenged and called into question. So scientists are both the sources and the targets. So relationships between the professional and trade and specialist journals and the scientists have always been easy, but sometimes they can be derailing as and when there are doubts or flaws, as was the case during the COVID crisis. So we need to come up with observations like many things can be improved, and we need to come up with proposals. You did make proposals, and this is possibly the purpose of the Appel de la Sorbonne here during this conference, in this symposium. We'll need to say and state how there can be more established connections between the health professionals, faculty, academics, and journalists and media people. And we'll need to come up with a large development work, because it's only via and by way of symposiums, by exchanges, by joint research and joint development work that we can give back science, we can give science its role back. And I will end by saying that for the first time, almost the first time, INSERM, by way of the COMETS, was able to publish a paper, a report, which is quite a lengthy report, which says it all in substance. Analysis was done, some solutions are put forward, and it's almost the first time when I see a large French health and scientific institutions making a statement on an issue of substance, which is that of scientific communication. I believe that scientific communication is connected with scientific knowledge. And Jean-Francois Delfresso, whom I admire greatly, said in his introductory remark that it were two different things. In fact, this will be my end, where the tandem is sometimes a terrible, infernal tandem, but it is indispensable. If you want to engage in public health, you are forced, as Amadou Sall said, who is based in Dakar, Flow side, there's no point in producing if you don't explain what you have produced. So public health, you want to develop, you need to work with the media and the professional and scientific media, like Horton's media, like ours, and obviously with the general public press, like Daniel Messager will tell us all about. Thank you, Pascal. So there's a natural transition here, because since Jerry Grisselny spoke with the various speakers, we can see that the notion of science, reliability of science, ethics of science is of importance. But at the end of the day, especially when it becomes an extremely important priority for societies, the way science is perceived and told, Gilles' storytelling, if I understood you well, is of great importance. And Daniel Messager is extremely well positioned to discuss and handle these aspects, because he has great experience in the field of media and science. Well, it's been 30 years that I've specialized in health aspects and health issues, and there are a number of points which should be takeaway messages. Richard Horton said so. When you are a health specialized journalist, it is an old tandem, as you said, Pascal Morin. But in this pandemic crisis, they were a very special event. Never, and I worked on AIDS, I worked on many pandemics and epidemics, never were we confronted with this tsunami wave of information. I'm speaking about a tsunami wave because I had the image of waves on information on top of other waves coming from Asia, coming from the US, and you needed to produce general public information. One of the points of importance is that we need to go back to the basics of journalism here. What are the basics of journalism? Well, first, high prioritizing information. There was a wealth of information, but we shouldn't be using all of this information. Otherwise, you would be drowning people under this wave of information. You needed to prioritize, you needed to check and double check and verify. This is one of the basics of journalism, but this was a bit more complicated because, as we saw, this wealth of information had to be sorted out between preprint. You had to wait. There were embargoes. What had to be said off the record officially. This was very complicated, and I was working, and I had been working in France Inter for many years. You know, the radio channel are immediate media. Of course, there's the social media now, but when you switch on your radio, you want to have immediate and fresh information, and immediacy you need to do things right, and you need to do things quickly, and you don't want to rush and be reckless with doing things quickly and doing things right. I will mention two examples when the first results came about from Didier Raoult in the prime hours of the morning radio, and we didn't issue this information immediately, and it was a good thing. And when the results from Pfizer BioNTech came about, this was flash news. Everybody was waiting for it, but I was asked at the same time to explain immediately the principles of ARN messenger, and I slowed down the process because honestly, I would have been mediocre. My information would have been very poor because I didn't have all the basics of information to explain what ARN messenger technology was. But I could do it because I had experience and expertise, and I could slow down the request from my editors. What we were confronted with in this crisis is that this information expert journalists who were health specialists had to receive this information and slow down the process of information so that we did not we did not submerge the general public, but our editors were exerting pressure. I could do it because I had legitimacy, I had this expertise, which was my experience, but this is something I wanted to say, but you said it all. Jean-Francois Delfresso said it. There's a need for training and educating journalists, especially health and medical journalists. Scientific training and education should be given to journalists. It's not done enough in schools of journalism. It's not abundant enough. I trained on the job like many of my colleagues and counterparts, but with the reckless character of the crisis, you need to have more in-depth, more intense training and education of young journalists, especially in schools of journalism. And you could imagine having connections between schools of journalism and universities to provide this background training education so that the editors and the management teams of diverse media that journalism need such training before they provide data and information for this data and information to be credible. So the basics and having protections, and you need to have very strong protection, and protections involve checking and double checking information. All media had these protections of deciphering, sifting through the information, identifying fake news. This has to be reinforced. Journalists should not hesitate doing flash news and podcasts and specials to hear and hear again and repeat and explain and you heard many people saying that we are at a clue, we are totally lost because and it's normal. People are not stupid. It's not because they don't understand. It's because there was too much information and that journalists did not take time enough to give explanations and spend time explaining and repeating. Let's not hesitate to do special reports and to focus on some points on contamination, on transmission, on communication, on the immunity, on efficacy and effectiveness of vaccines, saying things, explaining and explaining again, training people, training young people, building upon networks. We are talking about Europe and European policies here, building upon our networks of European correspondents. In the Radio France network, we have European correspondents based in Brussels, in the Netherlands, connected with the European Medication Agency, what was happening in Berlin, in Rome. At the same time, during this pandemic, we needed to build upon what was happening in those places, to follow and monitor the developments of the pandemic, to see whether decisions were being made and whether an aligned European health convergence was being developed. So we are not out of the crisis. We need to strengthen the fundamentals and basics of journalism, to strengthen the protections as well, because this is how we'll be able to provide credible and well-documented information, not slow down the openness of knowledge. Openness of knowledge is something which journalists have to tap into and have access to. And we found it very difficult, especially in the early phase of the pandemics, to get reliable information from official institutions, to gain information which were submitted to censorship. And Jean-Francois Delfresso is very much aware of the opinions of the French scientific committee. The scientific committee would provide its advices and opinions to the French government. We knew exactly the date and time when these opinions were given, except that we could only use this information 2 weeks after the fact. And this is just not acceptable. So knowledge and information need to be made accessible, need to be made available, so that we are not only transmitters of information, but that we can use information, build upon it, and explain them and put them into perspective. This is what I can share with respect to my own experience, and I believe that we've learned a lot. We learned a lot with respect to making scientific knowledge mainstream and explain it. Everybody became experts in epidemiology. We all are experts in epidemiology in France, journalists and general public alike. We've learned a lot, but it's important that we can use this to strengthen the credibility of information.
C'était très intéressant. Alors malheureusement, on va pas avoir beaucoup de temps pour discuter parce qu'on a épuisé notre quota horaire, si je comprends. Le gardien de temps, d'ailleurs, il n'a pas abusé de son privilège. Hein, il a été parfait. Voilà, donc je vais d'abord et surtout remercier l'ensemble des intervenants, ceux qui étaient à distance, qui sont peut-être encore là pour Richard Horton. Je ne crois pas que ça soit le cas pour Yves Flukiger. Et puis, on va passer à la séquence suivante, qui est celle de l'appel de la Sorbonne et donc du travail des rapporteurs, sachant que Frédéric Lagarde sera peut-être le rapporteur le plus actif, puisque nous ne sommes pas concertés.